In the first video in my Finnish Mosins series, I covered Finnish independence, the Red-White Civil War, and their overall use of the M91 three-line rifle. I kind of skimmed over the difference between the Army, Civil Guard, and the rivalry. Over the 2 decades between the Civil and Winter Wars, they would approach improvements to the Mosin differently, starting with how they obtained barrels to replace the corroded barrels on poorly stored rifles before Finnish industry could produce new barrels in large numbers. In this video, I will cover the Civil Guard's M91-24 and the Army's P-Series Mosins. And my primary source is Finnish Mosins three-line rifle to Ukko-Pekka by DiRisio, which can be bought on Wet Dog Publications. The Finnish Army and Civil Guard were both born from the White Guards from the Finnish Civil War. Taking a 100,000-foot view, Finland was a semi-autonomous part of the Russian Empire during most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, with their own army formations. After the Russo-Japanese War, the attempted Russian Revolution, and Finnish general strike in 1905, Tsar Nicholas II attempted to force Russification upon Finland and dissolve these formations, replacing their service to the Russian state with a mandatory tax. Citizen Civil Guard organizations would form in the large towns split along party lines, forming the basis of the Democratic White Guards and the Socialist Red Guards. Some Finns would join the German army in World War I to fight against Russia in the Jager Battalion. As Russia exited the Great War and turmoil took over Petrograd, Finland would declare independence on December 6, 1917. All the state really had for enforcement of this were militias and paramilitary organizations who possessed little if no training, the White Guard. There were also the Red Guards who envisioned a socialist state. This would lead to the short but deadly Finnish Civil War, which lasted from late January to May of 1918. Initially fought between the all-volunteer and poorly trained White Guards and Red Guards, the Whites would be bolstered by Finn-born leaders such as Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, a former Russian Imperial Army general, returning to Finland after Russia exited the Great War, and the Jager Battalion who were released from fighting by the Germans. The Whites would conscript and use the battle-hardened and professional Jagers as a nucleus to form a professional army. The Red Guard were unable to achieve conscription and quickly succumbed to the superior forces of the White Army. After the war, the Finnish Defense Forces, which included the Army, Navy, and after 1928 the Finnish Air Force, would have universal conscription and be funded by the state. The White Guards, or Civil Guard, would be in all voluntary organizations which would act as a veteran corps, home guard, and a non-governmental organization, although in military matters they were part of the national chain of command. Every municipality would have a Civil Guard chapter, and the Civil Guard would be funded mostly locally. A women's paramilitary organization, the Lada Svard, would also form. This local funding would mean that the Civil Guard at times was much more well-funded than the Army, which shows in a different route they took to solve the problem of replacing worn-out and badly corroded barrels in M91 rifles. In my last video on M91 Finn Mosins, I went over in detail how Finland decided upon and obtained their three-line Mosin rifles. When speaking about Finnish Mosins, it is important to remember that they never produced a receiver themselves, and all their rifles are various stages of rebuilt American, Russian, or French-made rifles. The rifles left over from Russian occupation in the Civil War had seen hard use. They were also poorly stored, leading to the need to replace corroded barrels. While the Army looked at domestic solutions to replacing these barrels, the Civil Guard would look to foreign manufacturers of the barrels thanks to funding by the Lada Svard Women's Auxiliary. The differences would form a split in the updates of Mosins until they were forced to come up with one rifle in the M39 a decade and a half later. The Army first looked at domestic production, and the SAT ammunition factory in Riihimäki attempted to produce barrels sometime before 1922. Only 156 barrels would be made before a fire shuttered the factory, before the Civil Guard bought it in 1927. As talked about in the M91 video, Tikkakoski had ramped up to produce barrels in 1925, but demand for barrels far outstripped production ability. During this time, Finland would scour Europe for Mosins and Mosin parts. One of these excursions would be Captain Arvo Saloranta being sent to Italy. Not only was he able to secure Italy's captured Mosin rifles and Maxim machine guns, which would net Finland around 40,000 rifles, he would bring back an idea used by the Italians to create some rear echelon rifles to free up carcanos for the front during the Great War. Giuseppe Salerno devised a method where the sleeve would be press-fitted into the larger bore barrel of the antiquated Verli Vitali 1870-87 rifle that originally fired a 10.4mm black powder round. This rifle would be rechambered and have a Mannlicher style magazine added to it, and it would be able to fire the 6.5mm Carcano round. The rifle would become the 1870-87-15. These would have problems and were nothing more than a stopgap solution to free up modern Carcano rifles for the front. Salerno would bring this idea back to AV1 in Finland in 1925 to attempt to restore the piles of corroded barrels. The M91s would be disassembled, the barrels would be bored out, a new sleeve would be press-fitted into the barrel, and the barrel would be re-rifled. The old arsenal marking on the barrel would be scrubbed off and would be marked with a P followed by the 2-digit year. There are a few P25s and P28s out there, with most of these barrels being relined in 1926, the P26, and 1927, the P27. The P stands for the Finnish word for piped. There is also either an A, B, C, or S marking, depending on the chamber measurements used. 15,000 barrels would receive this treatment before it was ended in what would become part of a major scandal for Salerno. An aside, last fall I made a quick video detailing the difference between an M27 and P27 Mosin, while Joel at Panzerfaust Armory had both. Well, I actually ended up purchasing the M27 and later a P26 from him. My main source for that video was a YouTube channel called the Mosin Museum, as DiRisio's book wasn't out yet. The Mosin Museum is a very knowledgeable channel, and I recommend it. I'll leave a link to it below. But there seems to be a different feel about the scandal from that channel, and DiRisio from both his book and my personal conversations with him, as DiRisio is pretty passionate about Salerno getting the shaft, and considering these rifles that had these barrels in later conflicts did well, history shows Salerno to be exonerated in my humble opinion as well. So let's get into the deep and dirty of that scandal. Salerno was only a captain when he was appointed to lead the Chief of Defense Ministry Ordnance Department in 1925. He was junior to many of his peers. He would also be difficult to work with. In November 1927, he accepted a position of the Director of the State Rifle Factory, or VKT, to start production of Lottie's M26 light machine gun. His successor, AV1, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hurry, would begin an inquiry into the misuse of state resources by Salerno in what appears to be a personal grudge. An initial inspection in 1927 concluded that only 15% of the barrels were satisfactory, 20 to 35% were unfit for use, and the remaining barrels needed repairs. This would end the barrel relining program in 1928. Another investigation occurred in 1930, stating only 14% of the barrels were satisfactory, with the other 86% unfit or needing repairs. Assembly of rifles with these barrels were stopped. Salerno was court-martialed, sentenced to 35 days confinement, and fined 1.3 million Finnish marks to be withheld from his salary, and his reputation was deeply sullied. In 1930, only 4,331 rifles fitted with the barrels were in service, with the other 10,000 stored. As war with the Soviet Union looked inevitable, these barrels would be deemed adequate and fit to the rifles. While one can surmise that this was "we need rifles, so F it" situation, none of these rifles would have an accident, and they'd perform well during the winter and continuation wars. Salerno would receive compensation for the early prejudgment of the barrels, but would never see the court-martial fully removed from his record. While some will say that you shouldn't risk it and shoot your P-Series rifles, since they made it through 2 arduous wars without a catastrophic failure, I think I'll risk it and shoot my P-26. Do you think it'll be an exploding boy? Alright, this is a P-26. This is a barrel relined with the Salerno method. So that's the same method as the Verli Vitali 1870-87-15. So let's see if this is an exploding boy or not. I may be putting my life in danger here. I While the peace series is brought about as an attempt by the Army to fix the corroded barrel problem domestically due to meager funds, the Civil Guard would go another route as they had sources of funding not available to the Army. The Ladesvard Women's Auxiliary, named after the fictional wife of an Army private who went to the battlefield with him and tended to wounded soldiers after her husband was killed, was originally founded in 1918, associated with the White Guard. They would split off in a separate organization in 1920, where they performed social work and helped stoke the fires of Finnish nationalism. Later, during the Winter and Continuation Wars, they would replace conscripted men in hospitals and factories while serving in close cooperation with military defense forces. They would dissolve, along with the Civil Guard itself in 1944, due to Soviet demands that paramilitary organizations they consider fascist be banned. For the purpose of today's story, the Ladesvard would provide a major source of funds from the fundraising that would allow the Civil Guard to purchase barrels from abroad from SIG in Switzerland and Venus Waffenfabrik in Germany. After the Finnish Civil War, the Civil Guard assessed that roughly only half of the 70,000 M91s in their possession were in serviceable condition. As with the Army, the Civil Guard would cross out Arshin measurements on the Konovlad site and put new metric markings on the other side. Later on, there would be an extra step added for a 200-meter setting. A higher front sight blade was added. Originally, new barrels would be mated to the old receivers with simple repairs, and it was called good. In 1926, rifles that came through would see a more complete overhaul. Civil Guard rifles that received the new barrels would become the M91-24. There were some early rifles that received some reused M91 barrels, but were otherwise upgraded to the M91-24 standards, which would be referred to as ersatz rifles. In 1923, the initial order of 2,500 barrels from SIG would be identical to the barrels on the M91. Subsequent orders from SIG and Venus Waffenfabrik would see heavier barrels produced. These rifles would still need to accept the old M91 bayonet, so the barrel would be stepped down near the muzzle to accommodate this. The thicker barrels would require stocks and upper handguard channels to be widened to accept them. If you look for M91-24, these stepped barrels are a good first place to look at to investigate further. Only the early ersatz and first order of SIG barrels aren't stepped. The ersatz barrels will just have a 0 placed in front of the serial number on the left side of the wood and likely still retain their Imperial Russian markings. The last 2 digits of the serial will be stacked perpendicular to the serial on the bolt. The SIG barrels will be labeled with the actual long version of their name on the right side of the barrel with the Civil Guard crest and S with 3 first sprigs on the top. The Venus Waffenfabrik barrels will be labeled Bowler Stahl on the bottom of the barrel with the Civil Guard stamp on the top, nearer to the receiver than on the SIG barrels. For a deeper dive into the serial numbering, I encourage you to check out DiRisio's book, as this video will already be approaching 20 minutes by the time I'm done. Early in 1924, the work of replacing the barrels would occur at SYA, which is a Civil Guard workshop in Helsinki. It would be reorganized in 1927 by the name you see on the screen, or better known to us as SACO. They would move into the disused SAT ammo factory in Riihimäki. SACO makes firearms there to this day. The M91-24 would be produced here until supplanted by the production of M28s in 1928. The 91-24 would remain in service for the Civil Guard, although they would see a great deal of attrition during this time until 1939, when they would mostly be transferred to the Army during the Winter War. Some attrition was also due to an agreement in 1935 to allow Civil Guard members to turn their M91-24s, the cost split between them and the state, for new M28-30 rifles. The 91-24s would find their way into the Army during the Winter and Continuation Wars, and especially after the dissolution of the Civil Guard in 1944, where they were treated the same as any M91. The step barrels would cause some frustration, as there wasn't time to mill out stocks to fit them, so there may be barrel bands just jammed on them. When all else fails, a hammer becomes any tool. If they went through the Army depot after 1942, they'll have the ubiquitous SA mark on them, as my rifle does. The M91-24. This is a Sig Sauer barrel. Let's see how she fires. I actually purchased my example of the M90-124 from DiRisio. It has a SIG-step barrel. It has the S6060 serial number, meaning it came from the second order from SIG. The number on top of the barrel was moved there later by the Army and went through Army hands sometime after 1942, as indicated by the SA stamp. Luckily, this has an original type stock and not the latter TP stock. Although these rifles look very similar to each other, as well as the M91s to the naked eye, they demonstrate the different routes the Army and Civil Guard went to try and solve the same problem. This divergence will continue through the attempted updates to the Mosin Nagant made during the end of the 20s, which will be the subject of my next 3 to 4 videos. If you need to go back and see how the story all began, be sure to click over here. Otherwise, please join the GOA and get $5 off your membership with the link below. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.